Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am pleased to be speaking with Katja Hoyer. Katja has a master's in history from Germany. She is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, and she is a visiting research fellow at King's College London. She is a writer for the Washington Post, and she is the author of the new book, Blood and Iron, The Rise and Fall of the German Empire, 1871 to 1918. And that is the book we talk about in this conversation. We start the conversation by asking, what does it mean to be German, especially within the historical context, and why that was a question that was asked. We talk about Prussia and its various boundaries. We talk about the importance of the German Revolution in 1848. We talk about the character and rule of Otto Von Bismarck. We talk about unification and the Constitution of Germany in 1871. We talk about the might and power of the Industrial Revolution with the economic boom at the turn of the century for Germany, changing of the Kaisers, and Germany's involvement in World War I and the subsequent aftermath. I had such a fun time talking with Katja. She has such a wonderful voice and a wonderful mind. She's very, very sharp on German history and just all things generally on German politics and what's going on in Germany. Her book is absolutely fantastic. I greatly enjoyed reading it, even for someone that's not German. It's very, very, very fascinating to understand. As we mentioned in the conversation, a part of Germany's history that we don't hear a lot about. We always hear about the Third Reich or Nazism, but it's really important to understand on its own the establishment of Germany as a country and how young it is in its current state. And so her book does that. And so now I bring you Katja Hoyer. I am here with Katja Hoyer. Katja, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm looking forward to talking with you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Of course. So before we get into your book and we get into all of the contents there, why don't you just tell listeners who you are, what your background is, and what you research and write about?
So my name is Katja Hoyer. I was born in Germany, East Germany, just about still. And I've basically moved to Britain about 10 years ago now, I think. And I write in English, even though that's, as you can probably hear, my second language, or a foreign language to me rather than my native language, which is German. And I am basically very interested in German national history in the widest sense. So I do think, because it's one of the youngest European nations, indeed one of the youngest kind of nation states, really, and hasn't really quite found its place in the world with all of the calamitous consequences that had in the 20th century. I think there's a lot still to be researched and thought and debated when it comes to sort of German identity and German history.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you do just that. Your book is Blood and Iron, The Rise and Fall of the German Empire, 1871 and 1918. It's a great title. So it's a really nice title, actually.
Not my words, as I'm sure to discuss.
Yes, right. And it's very good. I think it's one of those things where history books can kind of be dry or boring, but you have a really nice way of writing and making it very interesting. And, in some ways, many of these figures become like almost characters in a story. And that's how it kind of read to me. And so it's very interesting. Obviously, people talk a lot about the Third Reich in that period, but it's interesting to see how modern day Germany was formed, and then what was leading up, and the whole period that was leading up to World War I, and then after that subsequently. So so I think it's really, really fascinating. So okay, so
yeah, I mean, that's what I was sort of trying to do with that as well in many ways. The idea that people don't know that much about it, because people are so focused on the Second World War and Nazism, and many people, I don't think, go into enough depth on what came before and sort of see it in its own right rather than as a lead up to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, certainly, I mean, there's probably elements of that you can kind of see, like, you can see the kind of ripple effect, but it does seem that this should be looked at in its own right, and that's definitely what you do. So I guess the the first question is this is something that kind of gets thrown around a little bit in the book, and so maybe you can kind of give some context. But I guess there's this idea, and various figures have talked about this, philosophers and musicians, but about what it means to be German, right? So as you say, it's a relatively new country, right? So this idea of the fatherland mentioned by Wilhelm in 1813 speech. There's the Battle of Nations, which is important for German nationhood. But what is it, I guess, this idea of German, what it means to be German and as an identity or a nationality? What does that originate from? How do folks try to understand that?
Well, I think that's been part of Germany's problem, because there isn't a straight answer to that, simply because there are no sort of physical boundaries that clearly determine where and what Germany actually is. So when you look at, say, the US, for example, the whole idea of sort of manifest destiny, this coast to coast kind of identity, there are very clear sort of physical boundaries, east and west at least, to where the United States is. Or you look at Britain, very sort of clearly identifiable kind of island mentality there. Or France, you got the coastlines around it and the mountains and on the two other sides, and that is just not the case really with Germany. So it's in the center of Europe, and the northern part of it is very sort of flat plains. There's really no obvious kind of beginning and end to Germany, and even if you pin it on say language, as a lot of people have tried to do, you end up with problems, because German speakers were spread for the reasons I just mentioned all over Central Europe, all the way to what is now Russia in the east, and Romania and those kinds of areas, and then on the other side, in what is the Netherlands and areas like that are kind of, in terms of their dialects and their way of speaking, very similar to German as well. So that was indeed one of the things that people grappled with in the 19th century, what it actually means to be German. And I think in many ways, this identity was forged in lots of negative events, like the First World War, for example, is a crucial one in my view, whereby, Germans kind of go through an event, a calamitous event like that together, and end up being kind of bound together by the trauma of it rather than by a positive experience. And I think that's a lot of the kind of problems and the insecurities of Germany today, I think, stem from this kind of negative binding experience, as opposed to as opposed to a positive one.
Yeah. It's interesting how it's an ongoing question. Maybe just for listeners, give some context here. You talk a lot about Prussia in the book. Many listeners may not. Well, my listeners in Europe and maybe around the world will be like, yeah, we know what this is. But maybe for American listeners, could you describe just like briefly just Prussia, how it's connected to Germany, and then how Germany became its own from that?
Yeah, so Germany didn't exist up until 1871 when my book starts, so it wasn't a unified nation state. So effectively you had lots of German-speaking like kingdoms and principalities and free cities. There were over 400 of them before the 19th century. And Prussia was effectively one of those. So you had the Kingdom of Prussia, which is in the north of Germany, around the area. Actually, Berlin and Brandenburg, which is right next to it, are sort of the center of it, if you will, for a long time of Prussia's existence. But it stretched all the way over into what is now Kaliningrad and was Königsberg at the time, which is now a Russian exclave in the Baltic sort of region. So it's basically the northeastern part of Germany, and then stretching along the Baltic coast, where northern Poland, Lithuania, those kinds of the Baltic states, and all the way into, as I say, nearly up to Russia. And indeed, they had shared a border basically with Russia at the time, as they had sort of divvied up Poland between them. So it's that kind of part of Europe that we're talking about.
Yeah. And so we'll get to 1871, but I guess there's two major things here first. So there, 1848, you talk about was the this type of German revolution, right? And there's things we get Marx out of this, and we get a lot of other things. And so out of that revolution, there was the flag and the anthem and many other, kind of cultural things. Just say how momentous the German Revolution in 48 was, leading up to kind of 71.
It's huge. I mean, it's really quite a potent mix of different ideas there. I mean, you mentioned Marx. He'd just written his Communist Manifesto, so those ideas are floating around. Socialism, communism are sort of for the first time beginning to become sort of concepts, if you will. And this is really fueled by the fact that Germany was a bit late to the table in terms of the Industrial Revolution, at least when compared to Britain and France. And therefore you get this urbanization and the squalor and the kind of bad conditions that come from that in the middle of the century. And as a result of that, many workers are sort of looking to find a better way of living effectively. I mean, capitalism is still a relatively new concept at the time as well. And then they sort of feel that that system is stacked against them. And it doesn't really help that you have very bad harvests in the early 1840s as well. And all of that is coming together to make life very, very difficult for the majority of the population in that time. And so you get this uprising, and the ideas that come into the kind of misery and the social problems are socialism and communism on the one side, but also liberalism, the idea that this is, Germany or Germans would be better served if they had a parliamentary democracy and could sort of, level out the playing field that way. So you have a lot of liberals who are now arguing that a common German state should exist in order to basically have a constitution so that the monarch gets tied to the law as well, as opposed to being able to kind of run the country in a medieval style monarchy. And all of that's basically coming together. It really frightens the old aristocracy because a lot of the monarchs sort of physically get dragged out of their estates, and it looks like kind of an actual revolution is afoot, and might well end up in a complete toppling. Remember as well that the French Revolution isn't that long ago at this point, so we're talking sort of a few decades at this stage. 60, 70 years. So this is still culturally very much in the air. It hangs there as a kind of spectre for European monarchy that, Republicans are there, and suddenly Republicanism seems to become a kind of widespread belief. So all of that is around, and it compounds the idea of a Germany as a kind of liberal nation state. So the idea that it could become a counterbalance really to the old world or to the old ways.
Yeah. I think it's interesting thinking about that, and then thinking about shortly after, a couple, maybe 10 years or 15 years later, you have this rise of Otto von Bismarck, right? So he's a central character, if you will, in your book, and in the history of Germany at this point. So maybe just tell us about him, right? His character, how he did things, and then how he became, minister of Prussia in 1962, and so forth. So just kind of tell us kind of about his temperament, his character, what he was about, and then how he rose to eventually being chancellor.
So Bismarck was a Prussian, so basically in that kingdom that we were talking about earlier, and grew up as a member of the so-called Junker class. So these were Prussian landed aristocrats who basically owned large amounts of land in Prussia, and were, as a result of that, very, very conservative and wanted to preserve the power of the old aristocracy. They all had titles. They all based their power basically on a kind of almost feudal-like system. The problem is as well that if you have an industrial revolution going on at the same time, it basically makes land ownership less financially viable, and so in effect, it's no longer their money that keeps them afloat as their status. So the moment you sort of chip away at that and end up with the more liberal system, it means the aristocracy is going to lose their status. And Bismarck grows up in that context, kind of trying to preserve his own social class and the class of his fellow Junkers, effectively. He's born in 1815, the year that Napoleon is defeated, and also therefore grows up with kind of all these stories about kind of the glorious defeat of when the Germans all fought together to get Napoleon out of their lands. And then they actually these Napoleonic wars, that last bit of it basically is also known as the Liberation Wars in German, because it's kind of seen as the liberation of the German lands from the Napoleonic yoke, and therefore Bismarck grows up with this kind of sentiment of he is not a liberal, he's not a Republican, he's trying to preserve the old order, and when he eventually becomes the prime minister, if you will, or the minister president of Prussia in 1862, it's at the height of that conflict between the old world and this kind of these new ideas, really. So the Prussian king is really at a point now where, he's kind of struggling to get Parliament under control and to get laws passed, and especially military reforms, which he's trying to push through. And this really drives him to the brink of despair, and he's almost, he's in tears, almost on the brink of abdicating. When Bismarck suddenly enters the scene and says, "Well, I'll sort it out if you let me," and he makes him Prime Minister of Prussia. And it's in that context that the famous words that are the title of my book come about, Blood and Iron.
Yeah, so tell us about the infamous Blood and Iron speech. What was so important about it? Talk about maybe the military expansion piece of it. Just kind of tell us about the big moment here of this speech.
So before the 19th century, you didn't really have standing armies. People just couldn't afford those. And so what the king basically normally did is draw on militia forces. So you literally go out and ask your people to come out and sort of, take a pitchfork, literally sometimes, and sort of fight for you. And out of that spirit, when that basically was what happened in 1813 when Napoleon was defeated. So the king had drawn onto his people, said to them, "Follow me," and then this worked. And you get these massive, massive battles like the Battle of Leipzig in 1813, where Napoleon is defeated and driven out. And out of that rose a real spirit of, we're fighting for, not necessarily for the monarch, but for the land and for our culture, and together as Germans, as people who share a common culture and a common sort of, linguistic and cultural background. And that spirit was still there in the armed forces, and it's something that the monarchs were really worried about, because if something like 1848 happens, like these revolutions that we were talking about earlier, there's no way for the monarch to know which side his armed forces are going to be on. Are they fighting for what they see as their fatherland? And this might well be a republic, say, for example. Or are they fighting for the monarch? And this had got so kind of disconcerting after 1848 that the king was trying to change the way that the army was run effectively. And he was trying to put a really expensive, quite large standing army together that would be loyal to him effectively. And that, of course, because of the 1848 revolutions, really worried more liberal-minded people, because they were sort of saying, well, what will happen next time we go out and demonstrate or kind of start some sort of street protest? You're just going to send your soldiers out against us. And this conflict leads to a complete standstill between the king and his parliament in Prussia. So the king wants to change the military, and the parliamentarians effectively say, no, we're not doing that. And so nothing happens. And in that context, Bismarck gets made the prime minister, comes into parliament and basically tells them, well, look, if you want a unified Germany, the way to do it isn't debate and majority decisions and being nice and cuddly to each other, but it's blood and iron. We need to fight together. You've seen this in 1813. That's what will make Germany. And in order to do that, we need an army, we need military might. So these kind of words, blood and iron, he uses them deliberately to try and convince Parliament that this is the way forward. Parliament are not convinced. And Bismarck kind of just goes, fine, we'll do it without you then, and runs an illegal army budget and completely ignores them and gets away with it. And years later, I think it's in 1974, he has that kind of, in hindsight, legalized and ratified by the Parliament then. But basically just goes in and says, look, this is why we're doing this, and with or without you, this is going to happen. And so the king stays in power with Bismarck as his now indispensable prime minister. And that's where he comes in. And that's why those words are sort of the title of my book as well, because I think it's quite telling about how and why Germany came together in the 19th century.
Yeah, it's obviously a very strong speech. And so, almost 10 years later, you get the nation state, which is Germany, right? In 1871. I guess a few things here, just kind of that are connected here. So you can answer them in whatever order you want. But I guess the one side thing here is the proclamation of a new state, a new country, was held in the Palace of Versailles in France, which again is very beautiful, but it's very interesting that it's in France. So maybe why was that the case? And then just tell us about how the Constitution worked, how the hierarchy functioned, and yeah, just those two first. How did it all come together in 1971?
Well, Bismarck sort of just did what he said he was going to do and basically unified Germany with blood and iron rather than with majority decisions and debate, and effectively provoked Denmark, then Austria, and then France into attacking or kind of declaring war on Prussia. And as a result of that, this evoked sort of a similar spirit as in 1813. So especially the French attack in 1870. So when the French king declared war on Prussia, this very much evoked the feelings again of the Napoleonic oppression and the kind of way that Germany rid itself, or Germans rid themselves of this Napoleonic attack. It helped that the French emperor in 1870 was also called Napoleon. That's Napoleon III. So in that respect, there's kind of another Napoleonic, another French invasion of the German lands, and Bismarck's able to sort of evoke the nationalist sentiment once again. And even Bavarians, get angry at the fact that Prussia is attacked when actually, they're miles away, they're culturally very different, and they were very, very reluctant to join in with Prussia in any shape or form. But if it's against the French, and if it's like an attack rather than Bismarck attacking them, they've kind of declared war on him. It's suddenly you get this thing which in the book I call defensive nationalism. So the idea that they're sort of stood together as a nation only because they're being attacked. And that happens, that works. And Bismarck basically at the end of all these three wars, which are all very short and very easily won by the Prussian side, uses the kind of nationalist fervor that came out of that to form Germany, and he gets all the different sort of princes and kings together and says to them, well, look, this is what we can do if we stand together. Let's found a nation now, and let's do it in a way that we can sort of preserve the power of the aristocracy at the same time. And so they have to do it outside of Germany, because if you found Germany, say in Berlin, there's absolutely no way that you get the Bavarian king, rocking up in Berlin somewhere and sort of bending knee to the king of Prussia, who's going to become the Kaiser of Germany. So that just wasn't going to happen. And so they choose the heart of, basically the French nation. Versailles is the royal palace just outside of Paris. The nation that had just been defeated together, and they choose that very location to found Germany because it reminds everyone of why they're there. It's off German soil and therefore kind of on neutral grounds. And it is a very grand kind of, sort of venue at the same time. So it worked very nicely in Bismarck's favor. And then the constitution that Bismarck then writes for this newly unified Germany reflects all of that. So it's basically a halfway house between the monarchy and its status being preserved. So the Prussian king becomes the German Kaiser. He's both at the same time, is worth saying. So he's still also the Prussian king. And he is the head of state, so akin to basically a president. And then you end up with Bismarck as the chancellor. So in a way, I always like to compare it to sort of a shop owner and a shop manager. So you have sort of the shop owner who, in theory, is in charge, but may not really know how the day-to-day business is run and how it all works, and relies on the sort of manager to do is that manager. And because he wrote the whole thing himself, he makes himself completely indispensable. There's no way that anyone kind of knows how the whole thing works, and certainly not Wilhelm, the Kaiser, Wilhelm I. So this is how Bismarck effectively sets it all up. But it's also worth pointing out that there is now a parliament that's elected by all men above the age of 25, which is very democratic for the time in 1871. So you have a universal male franchise for the first time, and that parliament has to pass all laws. So in that respect, even the king or even the Kaiser and his government are tied to the will of the people effectively, because you can't pass any laws without parliament saying yes to them. So it is pretty much half and half.
So this is the Bundesrat and the Reichstag, right? This is the parts of it that are all of these people that are there, or no?
Yeah, that's a bit like sort of what many states, including the US, have as well, where you basically have sort of an upper house and a lower house running in tandem. So the Reichstag is the parliament that gets sort of directly elected by the people, and the Bundesrat on the other side is the sort of like a regional council. So effectively, each of the states in the federal structure sends its own representatives there, and Prussia preserves the prerogative there, so they get enough members to be able to veto anything that Prussia doesn't like effectively through this. But at the same time, they can't also do their own thing because the other states combined are bigger than the Prussian delegates as well. So it's sort of a balance. But that's how he convinces the Prussian king to become the German Kaiser. He sort of says to him, look, you're not losing Prussia's power here. This will be an extension of Prussian power, which is partially true, but not as much as he'd given the Prussian king to understand.
Yeah, just a quick footnote here. You mentioned it in the book that some people try to draw a straight line from the official proclamation to Hitler's Third Reich, but you feel that's inaccurate. Why so? How can this live on its own without having to always have this kind of shadow of the Third Reich, kind of around it?
Well, I think the biggest reason against that is that it takes an awful lot of people out of an awful lot of responsibility. If you're saying it's inevitable, then all the decisions that are made between 1871 and 1933 or 39 or wherever you want to take this are null and void. So this means the people who decide to elect Hitler or who decide to support him or to make him chancellor or later to build concentration and death camps, all of those decisions that are made by individuals, become inevitable if you say that was always going to happen, and there are kind of straight continuities between the two. That's not to say that there isn't, of course, stuff that happens earlier that has an impact. So say, for example, there is already this so-called Völkisch movement going on, which Hitler, for instance, will buy into after the First World War. So this kind of idea that there's some ancient Germanic culture that needs to be revived, and this also already has some of the kind of sort of racist elements in it, genetic elements in it, where people see kind of a superior strain in sort of Germanness that got contaminated over the years, and then all of that, those ideas exist in kind of smaller extremist groupings. So that's not to say that Hitler comes out of nowhere, but at the same time, I do not see how you're talking sort of decades earlier, the very foundation of Germany need have led to what happened in the 20th century later.
So I guess let's talk about some of the politics here. So after the Constitution's ratified, Bismarck tries to unify the economic infrastructure with some of the social and economic gains, the creation of the Reichsbank, etc. So he breaks from the National Liberal Party, and then it splinters into the Progress Party and the German Radical Party. And so he's kind of what you're saying about the shop manager or whatever. He's kind of the de facto boss man. He's running everything. But tell us about what he was trying to do economically with the social economic stuff, and then the creation of a national bank, and then also where the parties, political parties, are splintering at this point.
Yeah, so initially he's got to work with the Liberals just because he's just created the thing that they've wanted and have asked for the last few decades. I mean, it is basically the middle classes who've argued for a liberal form of republicanism, effectively. Not all of them. Some of them are happy with the kind of sort of British style, constitutional monarchy as well. But all of them have asked for a parliament with a meaningful role, and Bismarck has just given them that. And now that you've got universal free elections, you're going to end up with what people want effectively in parliament. So therefore, the Liberal Party, the National Liberals, they're called, become the sort of strongest party in the Reichstag, and Bismarck's got to deal with that and work with them. But it works quite nicely to start with because they've been arguing for unified Germany for so long, and now that it's set up, they want to make sure it's kind of economically centralized. And Bismarck wants that as well because it effectively helps Prussia, extend its economic developments into the whole of Germany. So Prussia had by far become the most technologically advanced country in the Industrial Revolution, not least because it suddenly got coal fields and iron ore mines and things like that in its territory. So it's really shooting ahead, and now that it's unified, it can benefit from having this larger market and a bigger work force basically to draw upon. So Bismarck and the National Liberals initially are pulling in the same direction. They all want unified currency, for example. Units, measurements, weights, that kind of stuff unified. You want to be able to get goods and people from A to B, so they're all happy to have, say, a national network of rail and roads going crisscrossing the country, those kinds of things. So Bismarck works happily with them throughout the 1870s, setting all of that up effectively. The one thing that they do carry on arguing over is the military, for exactly the same reasons. I mean, you still have the same parliamentarians effectively sitting there that sat there and argued with the Prussian king in the 1860s. So that doesn't go away. Bismarck finds kind of various different compromises there, and sort of makes compromises. But it's interesting that he's forced to compromise as well. So there's certainly a kind of really kind of quite strong intent there now from Parliament to do its own thing as well. And the alliance effectively breaks at the end of the 70s, when Bismarck is coming under a lot of pressure from the landed aristocracy and other forces. They're worried because there's a recession going on, and they see kind of the emergence of modern capitalism as the reason for that, and free trade and all those policies that come with it. And so they want more protectionist kind of old school policies that protect particularly things like grain, which is of course their economic basis. If you're like a land owning kind of aristocrat somewhere, you need to make sure that you're not going to get outdone mostly by Russian and Canadian grain at this point, which is imported. And so Bismarck needs to sort of break with the National Liberals, does that. As you said earlier, the party splits in the process, and Bismarck has got quite a hand in that with his backroom machinations, basically, where he sort of splits the Liberal Party completely and destroys them in the process. So he doesn't kind of, deal in half measures, and joins forces with sort of more conservative elements like the Centre Party, for example, the Catholic party, and therefore ends up with a split basically between the 1870s and 1880s, where it's much more protectionist, socially conservative stuff going on.
Well, to that end, you talk about it in the book at a certain point, which is really interesting, because I think you could probably see some of the ripple effects of this even still today. Of course, there's a long history there, but this idea of made in Germany, right, is this kind of branding of sorts, right? That how you talk about how Germany was naturally suited for industrialization because of its geographical conditions, natural resources, and this was all part of the foundation boom. So you mentioned sectors of iron and coal, agriculture, electrical goods, mechanical engineering, all grew in this period, and I can imagine you see still some of that still to this day. So just talk about this period of how this was like a huge boom, and how it was able to produce in these many different types of sectors.
Yeah, it's really interesting because as you say, like all of that is basically so ingrained of what people, including Germans themselves, associate with Germany as part of its, kind of national culture, things like cars and engineering and this kind of made in Germany.
I've had an Audi before. I mean, they're great cars. They're fantastic cars. They're amazing. They're amazing cars.
Yeah, all of that certainly comes from that time. I mean, Carl Benz, for example, was a German engineer, sort of, designed what is widely considered the first kind of, practical car, really. In 1886. So, all of that's going on. I think initially the defeat of France helped with that, because basically France was charged reparations for the Franco-Prussian War, and then ended up with those. I mean, they paid them back quite quickly, within just a few years, I want to say 3 years, and they paid them off. But it provided an initial boost for a country that had only just formed, that they were basically being sent sort of boxes of gold, which literally, were kept in Berlin all the way up until 1914 as kind of a war chest, the literal actual war chest, with gold coins from France in them. So that obviously helped, because it then meant that, creditors knew that this kind of new state, which was still an unknown entity, could be trusted with loans and things. People invested in it. So it was huge, this initial boom. And there was a little bit of a dip, as I was saying, in the 1870s. And that frightened people a little bit, because they felt it was caused by free market policies and by kind of going too far in the libertarian sort of direction. And then Bismarck rode back with that, mostly for political convenience, really. I don't think he had particularly strong views himself on the economy. But he seemed to sort of ebb and flow in terms of his free market and protectionist policies in line with what the market needed, and it ended up benefiting Germany hugely. And then the fact that the education system was so good. So Germany had one of the highest literacy rates, I think the highest even in the world at this point, something like 98% of people, which is massive, at the end of the 19th century. It's because they made education compulsory and then pumped lots of money into it. So this effectively meant that, people could access higher education, kind of quite high-level apprenticeships because of the, scientific and mathematical skills that they already had from the school education. So you had a highly educated workforce, like throughout the different social levels. And so things like chemical engineering, for example, which is obviously quite a highly specialized field, ended up having enough, skill and workforce effectively there to drive it. And few other markets could produce the things that Germany produced at the time, is things like, early sort of electrical goods and the first cars, machinery, industrial kind of products, dyes, solutions, so those sorts of stuff, sorts of things as well. So all of that was really at the forefront of, where it was at basically at the time. And as a result of that, this kind of made in Germany brand began to develop. People associated German goods with quality and were therefore willing to pay higher prices for it, which meant German workers were comparatively well paid, and the living standards rose accordingly. So people in the 20s always remember the sort of pre-1914 years as the sort of the golden years, really, because people were reasonably well off.
Yeah, it's interesting how all of what they placed as an interest in or investment, how they were able to maximize that, and how there's still a kind of traces that we see of that. So throughout this time, you start to see some class divides, right? And you get different working class parties that arise, such as the SDAP. But take us up to where Wilhelm dies. Right, there was an assassination attempt previously, etc., but he dies, and then you get Friedrich III, and then that doesn't work, and then you get Wilhelm the second, who becomes the Kaiser in 1888 at just 29 years old, and then he starts to have issues with von Bismarck. So just kind of there's this kind of a very tumultuous and a lot of transitions in this time period, as in the late 1880s. So just tell us kind of this period and how things kind of settle down with Wilhelm II.
Yeah, I mean, you could argue that Wilhelm I just lived too long for like Germany's good, effectively. I mean, he was born in 1797, I want to say, at the end of the previous century, which is quite amazing, really, when you think we're now in 1888. He's virtually a piece of the old world that didn't exist anymore, and it drags on for a long time. And he still insisted, sort of throughout this time in power as well, that he would represent Germany on, important state occasions and things. So this meant that his quite liberal son, Friedrich III, didn't really have a chance to, sort of take over and modernize and do stuff with this new Germany. He was married to Vicky, who was Queen Victoria's oldest daughter. So she was English, his wife. And you would have ended up with a much more kind of liberal-minded couple at the helm of Germany. So Friedrich III himself, very liberal-minded, married to, basically Queen Victoria's oldest daughter, who thinks she's going to run the country together with her German husband in the same way that Victoria and Albert do in Britain, namely as a constitutional monarchy that has sort of pushed the constitutional model quite far in the direction of, away from the monarchy effectively and towards parliament. But that didn't happen because effectively when Wilhelm finally dies in 1888, Frederick is already severely ill. He's got throat cancer, and effectively he can't even speak. Throughout his entire reign, and it's only 100 days long in 1888, is known as the Three Kaiser year for that reason. So basically, when the first dies, his son briefly takes over for 100 days, dies of the throat cancer he already had, so people knew that he wasn't going to last very long. And then Wilhelm I's grandson, Wilhelm II, takes over. And as you say, he's not even 30 years old. That is now a completely new generation. And he wants to do things differently. And initially, as I argue in the book as well, it seems like he's actually able to capture this kind of exciting spirit of the time that we were just talking about. So everything seems to be moving at blinding pace. You got stuff like photography, cinema, cars, trams in the streets. Everything seems to be completely different from, say, 10 years earlier, and people are really seeing this as a time of progress. And here's a young Kaiser who's almost childishly intrigued by all of that. He goes into the factories, he goes to see new ships being launched, and he loves the technology and talks to the engineers. And initially it really seems like, the new age that is dawning has now got a kind of somebody who's suitable to take Germany into this new stage.
Yeah. You talk about how he has this new modern era, of reigning, even things like having the Grand Prix, and what's now known as the Max Planck Society over there in Germany as well. So it's just interesting how many of his things, that he started are still around. But you maybe suggest that the growth was maybe too fast, right? And that maybe it had some impact on the 1907 depression. So how was the economics of this stuff? He's making all these changes, all of these things are happening, but where does the economy start to maybe take a slight hit, a couple years after?
The problem was always, I think, from the off that the economy was incredibly unbalanced. So you have got this incredible accumulation of wealth, technology, and it's pushing overall Germany forward very, very fast. Mm-hmm. But it leaves a lot of the workers, and particularly people in the countryside, behind. So there are still villages all across Germany. It's easy to forget, people who live in the countryside, because we always focus so much on the major cities. But there are people who aren't benefiting from any of that. They haven't got access, even say, to a train line to get anywhere. Never mind see all of this kind of progress going on, and there's really quite severe rural poverty as a result of that. And at the same time, the urban poverty is really getting very bad. So you have these sort of tenement houses, where basically people rent tiny little rooms, really, in kind of quickly built houses that are damp, it's bad conditions. Whole families kind of end up living in one room. As a result of that, you get outbreaks of disease. Hamburg is the worst example of that, with the cholera outbreak towards the end of the 20th century, where people kind of looked at that and thought, what century do we live in? Even at the time, that was just outrageous that you get this major cholera outbreak. And this was because the authorities had completely neglected the poor parts of Hamburg. Effectively, they were all still pumping water out of kind of old sewage systems and stuff like that. So that's happening at the same time. And if you have an imbalance like that, eventually you're going to, we see this today to some extent as well, eventually you're going to run out of purchasing power, basically, in the population, and people are going to be unhappy and demanding more sort of higher wages and better conditions and so on and so forth. So you see the rise of the SPD, the Social Democratic Party, very quickly in Parliament, and people demanding more rights for themselves. And Wilhelm responds to that initially by saying he wants to be the Kaiser of the rabble. So he wants to kind of be everyone's Kaiser, and he's not going to crack down on striking action and people being out on the streets. And Bismarck, for the 2 years that they run the country together, so Bismarck is still in power from 1888 when Wilhelm comes in for another 2 years. Bismarck sort of says to them, well, look, I've been around for a while. I know how these things go. If you don't do anything about them, it's just going to get worse and worse. And Wilhelm eventually realizes that as well, and becomes kind of swaps to the other side and becomes too uber-aggressive against the workers. He calls the parliament the ape house, because people argue in it, and it sort of reminds them of the monkey house and the zoo, which had just been built in Berlin as well. So these tensions are not just of a political nature, but they really bear down on the economy as well. And as a result of that, and again, you see this to some extent today, effectively the industrialists and the middle classes are saying, well, we just need more markets. Why don't we go out into the rest of the world and see where we can resource stuff and sell our things and explore new markets. And so there's this huge clamor for colonialism, because they sort of look at the British and the French models and go, well, that's how they solve their problems, so we should do it the same way. And that's effectively what leads Germany down a very, very dangerous path.
Yeah. So Bismarck resigns, and then you have a series of chancellors that are just kind of like a revolving door to coming in. You have a cop.
Not as much as now. There's only four between between 1819 and 1917. But yeah, right. It just seems that way because Bismarck was about 20 years before that.
Fair enough. But there are more than there's not one major person that's there for so many years. And so there's plenty that people can read in the book on that, but I guess what I want to ask is just two parts here. Is just briefly give the kind of overview of how there was the German colonial empire in the early 20th century and how they became a major player in the world stage. So just as not as a comparison point, but just as a point of reference, it took the United States a long time to become, I mean, it really was World War I, and not even, it was really World War II. But early 20th century for the United States to become legitimate, where people were like, okay, they have a big military, they have a naval thing, they have a whole enterprise here. And Germany, as granted, you have Prussia and many other ways in which they were connected for much longer in Europe. But as a country, Germany as a state has only been around for 40 some years, right? Maybe 35, 40 years. And they're already this big colonial empire. So just briefly give the thumbnail sketch of how they are a major player on the world stage so fast.
Well, one thing is the economy, as we were just saying. If you have that much economic power, people are going to take you seriously for that reason alone. I mean, especially Britain and the US become major trading partners of Germany very quickly, which is one of the reasons they don't end up destroying Germany at the end of the First World War. It's just because of the hugely lucrative trade between Germany and those two countries. Also, of course, personal connections when you think the huge amounts of Germans that leave the country and emigrate to the US. But it's also the military power as well. So Prussia had already had a pretty formidable reputation by then, given this was really due to the Napoleonic Wars, where they suddenly emerged as one of the European greats at the end of that. And at the same time, the changes that were made at the time, so the army reforms that came out of that made the army incredibly efficient. So it was very well organized and structured, and you already had kind of fairly modern command structures and things like that as well. So it's militarily taken seriously as a country as well, because effectively the military and the civil service structures and those kinds of things are taken over from Prussia, which was already seen as a very modern country. In fact, people come over from other countries at the time and sort of try to see how Prussia is doing it at this stage. And then with that comes kind of an aspiration to prove themselves as one of the greats in the world and in Europe. And this is one of Wilhelm II's obsession, really. So Darwinism is still a relatively new concept. So this idea of the survival of the fittest and then all that is relatively new and is still hotly debated in all of those sort of fashionable salons all over the world, including in Germany. And people are beginning to buy into the concept of the survival of the fittest and apply it to other concepts as well. And this includes nation states. So you end up with the idea that kind of all of the European states are vying, in this kind of small habitat that they're in Europe, are vying for resources, for progress, to become basically the fittest and most adept country. And if you don't do that, just like in the jungle, basically, you will perish and you will die out. And that's the sort of logic that they're beginning to buy into. So when Britain and France and Belgium and even the Dutch to some extent have all got sort of empires, and they're all arguing that these empires are economically necessary, even though they're expensive, of course, as well. But they're all saying, well, we need these markets, we need to expand. Then Germany is looking at that, particularly the Kaiser, and going, well, if we don't catch up, if we're not the fittest anymore, then we will eventually our economy will run out of resources, out of markets, and we will perish. The other countries will just destroy us again, especially as we are relatively new. And Wilhelm also becomes obsessed with an American theorist called T.R. Mahan, who's a naval captain, who wrote a book about sea power and world power and the connection between the two. And Wilhelm became absolutely obsessed with that. So the idea that if you want to be a world power, you need a large army with which you can then build an empire and police it and keep it. And so as a result of that, Wilhelm says, well, we're nearly a landlocked country, but we clearly need a navy to be kind of a viable state, a viable superpower, and therefore starts building up the navy massively, which aids up a lot of resources. And there's a lot of workers sort of saying, well, look, we're starving here, we're being hit by cholera attacks because you can't kind of modernize the sewage system for us, but at the same time we've got this massive navy going. But Wilhelm has this kind of book by Terman, sort of translated and given out to all the naval captains and people in parliament and whatever, and becomes totally obsessed with it. Which in turn, of course, just geographically, when you think about it, if Germany sails its ships out of its harbors, it has to go invisibly past like Britain and France, virtually past their coastlines.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a huge, threat if you see German kind of warships and trade ships sort of going in and out of Europe and building up at the same speed as the economy had done. So both of these countries think, well, we're going to be overtaken, and France is indeed overtaken very quickly. So Germany becomes the second largest naval power in the course of just a few years. So this really is quite worrying to the other nations, and a threat that Bismarck had anticipated, but Wilhelm kind of dismissed.
So you've kind of set it up for us as in terms of the context of Germany right before World War One. So, obviously there's been numerous books that have been written just on World War One and just on Germany's involvement in World War One. So obviously your book also covers this period as well. And so, I guess the biggest thing I want to know is you can just kind of give a summary of it, but it is interesting about how Germany, kind of had this preemptive strike against France, and then placing them to fight against Russia as well, and all these very interesting things. So obviously, there's the Ferdinand assassination, which you don't have to get into, but just Germany's role about how they had this preemptive strike, and then just a summary of how the war went and how it, wasn't so good at the end for them.
Well, it basically became, for all of the reasons I just mentioned, pretty obsessed with the idea that they are a new vulnerable state in the middle of Europe, despite the fact that they are also the largest state in Europe once they're unified, and are sort of surrounded by enemies. So the so-called sort of encirclement fear really grips kind of the circles of power in Germany quite badly. So there's almost, Bismarck even talked about a nightmare of coalitions, basically. So this idea that if France, Russia, and Britain join up, they're surrounding Germany in the center. And so they start planning for that eventuality fairly early, basically in the early 20th century. By 1905, they got the sort of infamous Schlieffen plan ready. Well, it gets changed a little bit later as well, but basically the idea that you're trying to avoid a two-front war should it come to war with any of the European nations. Then Germany needs to sort of look westwards first and deal with France quickly, because it's sort of the bigger enemy and the more dangerous enemy. Whilst Russia, it's argued because of its sort of the state of its economy and the way that it still hasn't developed as much as the Western countries, will take longer to mobilize and it was seen as the lesser threat. So you sort of deal quickly with the threat in the West, and then shift your entire army over to the East to deal with that on the other side. And this idea, when you think about this, it's already on paper and there and thought out in 1905, like nearly a decade before the First World War actually happens. So initially this is all war gaming, so they're effectively just sitting there thinking about different scenarios. The problem is that the Kaiser is really into this sort of stuff, so quite often he sits in on these meetings and is surrounded basically by these military figures at court, and this becomes kind of, it merges, and you can see this in the documents over time, from being kind of a theoretical wargaming thing to, well, war is eventually going to happen anyway, so we'd rather it happen sooner than later, because at the moment Germany's ahead. Russia is still very underdeveloped, but is obviously also catching up slowly. So all of that is a huge worry, and the kind of thinking is very swiftly moving from what if to, well, why don't we do it now if it's necessary in any case. So anything that then sparks this conflict and sort of serves as a spark isn't seen as a threat, it's kind of seen as something that was anticipated, that was always going to happen, and that needs to be dealt with, basically. And people don't panic so much in 1914, as certainly not the kind of inner military circle when the assassination happens of Franz Ferdinand, but see it kind of almost as a trigger for something that they've been planning for so long. You can also see how Wilhelm isn't particularly sort of concerned by the idea of a major European war. So when the Archduke was assassinated on the 28th of June 1914, he's shocked by that, because he was friends with him, they went hunting together, and there's kind of an attack on monarchy per se. And he's worried about that. But at the same time, he goes off on his holiday cruise, which he always took at that time of year, and he's basically off throughout the entire July crisis. He's off on his boat basically to Norway on his holiday cruise with his two dachshunds. So that just goes to show that he really wasn't anticipating what was going to happen over the next 4 years, and that doesn't obviously let him off the hook, but it does mean that I think it's quite obvious that he thought this was going to be a relatively localized war in the Balkans, which that was on the cards for a long time. Bismarck had famously predicted in the 1880s that a major European war is going to come out of some damn foolish thing in the Balkans, as he put it. And, this is in the 1880s, so we're talking decades before it actually happened. And then because of this kind of toxic logic of the Schlieffen Plan, here's a European war, we're going to be surrounded by enemies, we must strike west first. That logic kicks in. So even though at this point France has got very little to do with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, you end up with kind of, this is going to drag Russia in. If Russia's going to get dragged in, then their alliance with France is going to kick in. Who knows what Britain's going to do, because that's really not clear at this point. And the Kaiser is sort of hoping, because of his own, remember his mother is English, his grandmother was Victoria. He doesn't really anticipate that Britain's going to join in, so that isn't really seen as a threat. So this kind of logic, let's just knock France out, literally knock it out, as in, kind of very quickly make it kind of militarily unviable, and then deal with the Eastern War if we have to. Russia is soon going to realize that it's going to lose out of this, so it's probably not going to be a huge problem either. So people just think, it's going to be a localized war, which the other powers can be held out of. And then, of course, it all ends up very differently. Too much blood and iron this time for Germany.
So obviously, just fast forward us to the end of the war, what's just the state of Germany? I mean, it was really tough for Germany, still as a relatively new country, and they were just pretty much, decimated, in terms of their economy, in terms of many of their infrastructure, obviously their military, it was just what was the extent of the issues, and, how much of that, was a kind of, feeding ground for, obviously, World War II and everything else after that.
Well, the problem with the First World War was that it ended up being a completely new type of war. I mean, to some extent, you see the beginnings of that in the American Civil War, but A, it's not on the same scale, and B, it isn't really a kind of something that Europeans obviously would have been consciously aware of. But the idea that it's an attritional war that you're going to pour almost endless kind of resources and manpower into was just not really anticipated beforehand. So it really bled all of the European combatants dry in terms of entire generations, obviously, that were wiped out. But on top of that, the kind of economic and social and political cost of that. And because of all of that, the monarchy ends in Germany. So basically, there's what has been called the German Revolution in November 1918. That forces Wilhelm to abdicate. The American influence is quite big in that, because Wilson had basically said that there will only be peace if Germany becomes a radically different country, i.e. if the Kaiser goes, and some sort of democratic government is being installed. But on the flip side, Germany is not occupied as such. It's not destroyed. The war hasn't actually happened on its own soil. And I think that's an issue in itself, because in contrast to the Second World War, which really comes home to Germans in bombings and in actual occupation and in all of the hardship and the brutality that follows with that, you are basically left with a poor country that's completely indignant and angry and humiliated at what's happened to it, even though it's obviously played its own role in that fate. But without the civilians and the people who stayed at home actually having seen the combat, it's the people who come back, and they come back from the front lines with a completely different worldview, and have been sort of brutalized over 4 years of war, that add an element of political violence suddenly into European politics. So suddenly you have, kind of large-scale assassination attempts on politicians. A lot of them are actually murdered. You have the communists and kind of right-wing groups fighting on the streets, and all of that's happening in a society that itself hasn't actually experienced the war directly. So there's a lot of kind of conflict going on there within Germany, which bears out very badly. On the flip side, the entire country has for the first time gone through an experience together as a nation, and they've all suffered that defeat, the humiliation, the loss of family and relatives and all of that came with it. And so I would say this is one of the kind of defining moments of Germanness. This makes Germany, I think. It's interesting that the country doesn't break apart at the end of the First World War, even though it's still so fragile. There are, for instance, French attempts to try and do that. So they're, especially in the Catholic regions of Germany, they're sort of inciting this idea that, it was really a Prussian war, and come on Bavaria, and come on Rhineland, and why don't you split off now, and now's your chance. And this really doesn't go anywhere. It's quite interesting that at this point the nation is so compounded by 4 years of war, that those sort of separatist movements and the idea that they'd break away from Germany has pretty much vanished, and Germany is now there to stay for better or worse.
Yeah. Well, I know I want to respect your time. I know you're very busy, so I just want to say thanks for coming on. The book is called Blood and Iron: The Rise and Fall of the German Empire, 1871 to 1918. Where can people find the book, and where can people find you?
The book can pretty much be found anywhere, I hope, in your preferred bookshop. It's out in the US under the same title, Blood and Iron, with Pegasus, or that's the American publisher. And they can find me on Twitter at Hoyer_Kat. It's probably the easiest, where I put out a lot of stuff on German history. I try and sort of do a daily on this day thing where I cover the time span that we've just been talking about, but also going all the way into the present. I also write for the Washington Post on Germany, so if you're interested in current day affairs, that's another angle to that.
Yeah, no, I greatly appreciate you coming on. It was so much fun. The book is fantastic, and you're obviously quite brilliant at this stuff, and you have a great voice. So I really appreciate you coming on and chatting with me.
I enjoyed it as well. Always good to talk about Bismarck and Wilhelm and all the other interesting characters of the time period.
Yes, of course. All right, thanks.